This final video of the nervous system gives me the opportunity to point out some of the contents of the 8 videos that make up this playlist. It also gives me an opportunity to draw some connections between topics that are maybe mentioned in one and it's related to a topic in another, which I couldn't very well deal with as we went through it one by one. I'll also mention some of the nice little stories that are sort of like standalone little topics that show up in the nervous system. In the first one, we basically just looked at an introduction to the nervous system, representing it as a central nervous system with a brain that extends down the dorsal side. So we have CNS, which is made up of the brain here and the spinal cord. Remember that the central nervous system is very, very delicate. It's surrounded by those membranes called meninges. There's 3 membranes. The pia mater is the innermost of those 3, and it actually hugs the surface of these. It goes down in between the gyri into the sulci of the brain, recesses and things like that. The CNS is part of it. The PNS, peripheral nervous system, is the other part. Remember, there were 12 cranial nerves that come out of the brain and go to various regions of the body. There are a total of 31 spinal nerves that come out of the spine. The spine is divided up into 4 regions, and there's a certain number that come out of each of those regions. So you have the cervical, where there's 8, and the thoracic, there's 12, and lumbar, which is the lower part of the back region, there's 5 there, and the last part, there's 6 in the coccyx region. This peripheral nervous system, which is made up of those, has actually 2 components to it. The autonomic nervous system, which is the topic of video 7 here, and the somatic nervous system, which is the one that I talked about when we dealt with things like saltatory transmission, synaptic transmission, when an impulse is going from a nerve cell to a muscle cell or something like that. That's somatic nervous system. Somites, those are muscles themselves. In the second video, we focused just on the brain, and I can't draw a picture of the brain quickly, and I'm not even going to try, but I'll represent the brain as an orb like that, and it has features on it. This top part is the cerebrum. It's where all the thinking processes take place, all the associations take place up here. The cerebellum is for balance and coordination back here. So there's a total of about 10 parts of the brain that it's important to know about. The corpus callosum, remembers that thick, white, very light-colored tissue, dense tissue that connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain. Impulses that come up the spinal cord are sorted out by the pons. Remember, the pons is located about here. They pass the medulla oblongata, which is about here. The medulla oblongata is part of the brain stem. From the pons they go to the thalamus, which is the part of the chamber here, it's the walls of the ventricle in the brain, and the thalamus basically sends them off to whatever part of the brain they're supposed to go to. In the neuroendocrine control center video, I focused primarily on this bit here, which is the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands. Remember, there's an anterior pituitary which is connected to the hypothalamus by a blood vessel, and the posterior pituitary, which is actually neural tissue, not glandular tissue, and it's connected by nerves, obviously, and both of those secrete hormones that are very important for homeostasis. Video 4 gave me an opportunity to focus in on the difference between nerves and neurons, and then combine that topic into the business of the reflexes. Nerves, remember, are bundles of neurons. Neurons are the individual nerve cells, and there are 3 kinds of neurons that we talk about in most of the time anyway. There's the sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons that interconnect them. Sensory neurons and motor neurons have long parts that go out into the peripheral part of the body, and those long parts are surrounded by Schwann cells which make up myelin sheath. And what we mentioned at that time was that the myelin sheath, the Schwann cells that surround these things, these long parts, keep them separated when they're in a mixed nerve. So a mixed nerve, a bundle of neurons, you don't want to have a situation where there's a motor neuron passing directly beside a sensory neuron, and there's communication between those two nerve cells. So the myelin sheath made up of the Schwann cells keeps those messages separate. It also, when we get into this topic, it has another function. It speeds up the impulses, because when we mentioned saltatory transmission, we mentioned that the impulses can jump from node to node. Well, the nodes are little spaces in between the Schwann cells making up the myelin sheath, and if the impulse jumps from node to node, then you actually are speeding up an impulse. Perhaps a good way to make a connection with that is thinking of an earthworm or a slug. Those animals don't have myelin sheath. They don't have myelinated nerve fibers. They're not capable of rapid movement. It's always slow and sluggish. If they had myelinated nerve fibers, they could probably move fairly quickly. So those kinds of topics here. It also gave me an opportunity to, like I say, to mention the reflexes, and looking at the spinal cord in cross section. Remember, there's the lumen of the spinal cord there where the cerebral spinal fluid goes, and then on both the dorsal side and the ventral side there are things called roots. And ventral root doesn't have this feature which is present in a dorsal root. This is where the sensory neuron cell body is located. It goes in and makes a connection to an interneuron inside the spinal cord. The motor neuron cell bodies here, the interneuron like that. Very evident in these things, there's a difference in color of the tissue here, and it kind of resembles a butterfly shape if you think of it that way. This has an actual groove in here like that. This is gray matter, as opposed to white matter, which is on the outside. White matter is the fatty sheath, so these myelinated fibers sort of leave the white matter behind. The gray matter is all of the nerve cell bodies that make up the interior part of the spinal cord. So this is the reflex arc, where it comes in a sensory neuron, and without going to the brain for interpretation, makes a connection right back to the motor neuron. Saltatory transmission is the business of an impulse that is being conducted along a nerve fiber. So again, if this is a myelinated fiber, and those are the Schwann cells and the nerve fibers inside, the impulse jumps from node to node here, and we represent this change in electrical nature graphically. So we have a graph that looks like this, and this is like goes from minus 65 roughly millivolts up to about plus 40 millivolts. This is when sodium rushes in. We also call it an upswing, which is characteristic of the shape of this thing. And the downswing here, when potassium is moving out of the axon. There's a bit of an overshoot here. It becomes hyperpolarized. And that's simply because the potassium ions are in motion, and it takes a while for them to get back into position. This would be what it looks like if you're monitoring the electrical nature in one spot. So if you were monitoring it here, and if you had a series of impulses going along that neuron, you'd have a series of electrical discharges that look like this. One of those would be a tick. So if you had a single impulse, it'd be like a twitch or a blink of your eye or something like that. And if you have a series of impulses, you'd have a repeated action. If you had to have some sustained contraction where you're tensing up for a long period of time, you actually have these things superimposed on each other where there's no time for the muscle to relax in between. One other little thing I can mention, that if you stimulated a neuron in the middle, say this was the stimulus provided here, that impulse would be driven in both directions, because there's no way that this nerve cell can dictate which way the ions are going to travel. That's not the case with synaptic transmission, remember? And I'll just erase this and give you that picture. Synaptic transmission is the business of where you have the end of a nerve cell and a postsynaptic membrane. There's receptor sites here, and there's neurotransmitters produced and secreted from this side. This is a one-way transmission. It can only go one way because these receptor sites are only on a postsynaptic membrane. They are not over here. These vesicles are produced at the end of an axon. They are not produced in this cell here. So this is a one-way transmission, and where, like I said, the saltatory, there's no way to dictate which way that impulse will go. Except if you think now for a second, if there's the motor end plate, and there's the cell body, and here's another cell, another motor end plate, if you stimulate that nerve cell that way, and you get an impulse going that way and that way, would it go here? Yes, because that is the one-way transmission. Would it go to the next cell on this side if there was another cell here? No, it wouldn't, because that's trying to drive it the wrong way through the synaptic gap. Excuse me. One other little comment before we leave the transmission story. When you stimulate nerve cells like this, it's an all or none response. You either have a stimulus that's strong enough to make an impulse, or you don't have a stimulus strong enough to make an impulse. It's an all or none effect. It's not like a bigger stimulus produces a bigger response. It won't. If you have a greater pain, for example, that's because there's more nerve impulses, a larger number of nerves being affected. So a stronger stimulus may create more sensation because there are more impulses, not because there are bigger impulses. They're either minus 65 plus 40 or not. That's it. There's only one size of them. Video 7, dealing with the autonomic nervous system, is one of these nice little stories that I keep alluding to. Nice little story. Because the autonomic nervous system is that system that allows your body to maintain homeostasis. And there's the parasympathetic part and the sympathetic part. And what I presented in this one is that there's really 5 ways you can describe differences between the sympathetic part and the parasympathetic part. So that's a nice little story. And so is this one, really, this fight-flight response. There's about half a dozen things that go on in the body if you get really scared and your body's trying to survive some frightening situation. Nice little stories. That's a nice little story, this one. I think this topic here is also a nice little story because it has a beginning and it has an end. There's a story in here, but there's a lot more to that one. Reflexes is a nice little story. Neuroendocrine control itself is a nice little story worth mentioning. Brain parts and functions. Remember, there's about 10 brain parts and what their functions are. One other little thing that helps tie this whole thing together. There's a number of times in this whole business that I mentioned ganglion. I mentioned ganglions in the autonomic nervous system because there's ganglions of the parasympathetic nerves that are in your wrists, for example, or in your ankles because of the long preganglionic fibers. Ganglion is nerve cell bodies. I also mentioned ganglions in this topic, the dorsal root ganglion. So ganglions is something that shows up a couple of times, and all it is the location of nerve cell bodies. So I hope that summarizes the nervous system for you and allows you to pick out the nice little stories. I would like to, before we leave the topic, mention a few things about what can go wrong with the system. Obviously, it's a very complex system. It's throughout your body, and I'll just mention a couple of the things or a few of the things that can go wrong with it. In this topic here, we mentioned the meninges, those three membranes that surround and protect the central nervous system. The meninges can get swollen, and that's meningitis. It's a bacterial infection quite often, and when the meninges get swollen, they put pressure on the brain, or you can have spinal meningitis where the meninges down the spine are putting pressure on the spinal cord. So meningitis is one of those infection type things. Concussions, if you get a severe damage to the brain, sudden severe damage to the brain area, you can get a concussion. Concussions really are when it seems like the brain is actually moves within the skull, because there's nothing attaching the brain to the walls of the cranium. It just shifts its position. It causes breakage of blood vessels, perhaps bruising of brain tissue, and concussions take a long time to heal sometimes. There's Parkinson's disease, which I can't illustrate it in here, but inside the brain there's all sorts of neurotransmitters. One of those is dopamine. And what seems to happen in Parkinson's is your ability, or a person's ability to produce and secrete dopamine diminishes, so they aren't able to make those kinds of connections. ALS is degeneration of the motor neurons. Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's, and dementia are when the brain begins to lose its ability to make connections in there. Alzheimer's is associated more with protein deposits, and dementia is just the loss of brain function. Epilepsy is a situation where perhaps there's a shorting out in the brain isn't communicating properly, so it's going into convulsions or seizures. And maybe the last one I should mention is MS, multiple sclerosis. We have the myelin sheath. I don't have it on the board right now, but myelin sheath does two things. Remember, it prevents cross communication along nerve cells, or between nerve cells. It also speeds up impulses. Well, if the myelin sheath begins to deteriorate, then a person can have this cross communication, and nerve impulses will be slowed down. It's an autoimmune disease where the body's own immune system seems to be destroying myelin, the Schwann cells. Okay. So that sort of wraps up the nervous system. Again, if I've mentioned something that you need to go back and have another look at, there's the list. Thank you very much.